Battle of the Planets.
One of the most psychologically complex villains ever written for animation was never one person. He was two. A brother and a sister fused at the genetic level by an alien intelligence that needed a weapon and used their dying bodies as raw material. American producers spent 40 years making sure you never found out what he actually was. That is not a metaphor. That is the literal biological origin of the character known as Zoltar, and the people who brought him to American television buried it completely. Tonight, we're going to show you exactly what Sandy Frank Productions removed from the original Japanese series, why they removed it, and what it means for every single scene you watched. The character you thought you knew is not the character that exists. The character that exists is something the 1970s couldn't figure out how to sell to a network, so they built a replacement and handed you that instead.
Are of little use against my giant cuttlefish spaceship and my new weapons!
Who Zoltar actually was. The original Japanese series is called Science Ninja Team Gatchaman. It has been broadcasting since 1972, when Sandy Frank Productions acquired the rights and rebuilt it for American audiences as Battle of the Planets in 1978. They inherited 6 years of a fully realized character with a psychological architecture unlike anything else on television at the time. That character's name is Berg Katse. What the American version gave you was a classic villain template: cold, calculating, loyal to an unseen superior, perpetually launching new weapons platforms against a 5-person strike team. His motivations were conquest. His relationship with the entity known as Leader X read as standard command structure: a general following orders, an operative being directed. Clean, functional, completely emptied of everything complicated. The first thing you need to understand about Berg Katse is that the name itself represents an impossible equation. 2 people compressed into one, forced into a single existence through an act that was presented as rescue, but was, in every meaningful sense, a violation. Here is the part that the American version went to considerable lengths to hide. And once you see the mechanism they used to hide it, you will not be able to watch a single Zoltar scene the same way again.
Transmute. You ready?
Ready. Me too.
Transmute.
The crash. 2 children, a brother and a sister, a spaceship failing on a frozen, desolate planet. The kind of cold that doesn't kill quickly. It preserves you while the dying happens slowly around you. Life support collapsing. Rescue probability 0. The circumstances had moved entirely beyond anything human intervention could reach. And into that gap, into that precise moment where 2 young lives were running out in the wreckage of a failed mission, came something else entirely. Into that gap came Leader X. Leader X is not a hero in this story. What the malevolent alien intelligence performed in that moment was not a rescue, it was a harvest. The 2 children, reduced to their most fundamental biological state, to embryos, to raw genetic material, were fused. Merged at the cellular level into a single new entity, constructed from the raw material of 2 distinct human lives, 2 identities, 2 futures, collapsed and braided together into something the universe had never produced naturally. There was no consent involved. There was no negotiation. There was an opportunity and an agenda, and 2 dying children were the most convenient available material. That is Berg Katse. That is what walks into the frame every time Zoltar appears on screen. Not a man who chose villainy, not someone who was corrupted or radicalized or broken by circumstance after the fact. A created thing, designed, assembled, and deployed. An experiment that survived its own creation and had to find a way to exist inside a body and a mind that were, at their absolute foundation, divided against themselves from the very first second of their existence. The biological consequence of that fusion is the detail that broke the American producers. It is also the detail that makes every single scene in the original Japanese series work on a level that Battle of the Planets never achieved. We will get there in 60 seconds.
I await your orders, sire.
Your programming is complete.
The wound that isn't a metaphor. Berg Katse possesses the ability to shift between distinct male and female physical forms, not a disguise, not a shape-shifting power acquired through training or technology, a direct biological consequence of how he was made. 2 embryos, 2 genetic templates, and the body that resulted can express either one. The shift is involuntary at times, triggered by stress, by proximity to the G-Force team, by the psychological pressure of repeated failure. The body remembers both people it was assembled from and expresses that memory without asking permission. In the American version, Battle of the Planets, the moments where Katse's female form appeared were reclassified, relabeled, recontextualized as a spy's trick, a costume change, theater deployed by a scheming mind. The word disguise was doing enormous structural work. It was converting a core biological truth into a deception, and doing it so smoothly that an entire generation of viewers accepted it without question. The reasoning was the logic of American network standards in the late 1970s. Complex questions of identity, ambiguous gender presentation, genetic horror. These were not considered appropriate material for children's programming. The goal was a clean villain for a clean fight, someone the heroes could defeat without raising philosophical questions that the network wasn't prepared to answer. So they buried it. And that burial had a specific, measurable cost. What gets lost when you remove the biological reality is not just a character detail. What gets lost is the entire architecture of why Katse does what he does. And that architecture is the most disturbing thing in the original series. More disturbing than any weapon, any battle, any death. We're going to break it down piece by piece.
And that means little Keops walking into a big bundle of trouble.
The engine underneath everything. Think about what the dual form biology actually means as a lived experience. Not as a comic book concept, as something happening to a conscious being every day of its existence. You do not have an original self to return to. There is no before version of you. No prior identity you can reach back toward and reclaim. The moment of your existence and the moment of your fundamental fracture are the same moment. You were born already broken by the terms of your own creation. The fracture is not something that happened to you. The fracture is you. And the being who built the fracture into you is also the only being whose validation gives your existence any sense of meaning. That last part is the engine. That is what drives every order Berg Katse barks at his subordinates. Every weapon launched, every relentless assault against G-Force despite repeated failure, every moment of defiant, snarling resistance that looked from the outside like arrogance or obsession, but was, structurally, something else entirely. Underneath all of it runs a single current, the desperate assertion of a will that has never been entirely its own, fighting to prove that it exists independently of the being who manufactured it. The relationship with Leader X is not a command structure. It is a dependency built into the architecture of Katse's psychology from before he could have opinions about it. Leader X created a being who owes his existence to an entity that views him as a weapon. And Katse knows this. He is always, on some level, aware that the architect of his torment is also the only figure who confirms that his existence has meaning. Every failure against G-Force is therefore not just a military setback. It is a threat to the only framework of purpose Katse has ever had. The violence that follows each defeat is not rage. It is panic dressed as aggression, the behavior of a being desperately fighting to remain useful to the only relationship that makes him real. There is a name for what Leader X built. Psychologists have a specific term for this kind of engineered dependency, and when you hear it applied to a Saturday morning cartoon villain, something in the original show clicks into place in a way that 40 years of the American version never allowed. That is the next section.
No, and it looks like he left in an awfully big hurry.
What Leader X actually built. The technical term is traumatic bonding, a psychological attachment formed not despite harm, but because of it, in which the source of suffering becomes the only available source of meaning. Leader X did not simply give Berg Katse orders. Leader X constructed a being whose entire psychological framework was organized around a central absence, the absence of a singular, stable identity. You cannot develop a coherent self when you are constitutionally, genetically multiple. The normal process of identity formation, the gradual consolidation of a consistent internal narrative, was structurally unavailable to Katse from the first moment of his existence. So he reaches outward. He finds the being who made him and orbits that being, because the alternative is confronting the void directly. The alternative is the recognition that he should never have existed in the first place. The hunger for validation from Leader X is therefore not a character weakness. It is the only rational response available to someone built the way Katse was built. A being without an original self has no internal anchor, so the anchor becomes external. And Leader X, deliberately, systematically, is the only anchor on offer. What does Leader X require in return? Absolute subservience, total loyalty to an agenda of conquest and destruction. The terms were never negotiated. They were inherited, along with the dual forms, along with the split mind, along with the body assembled from two children who never had a say in any of it. Existence handed to someone as a punishment disguised as a gift.
Good. Looks like they're finally giving up their useless struggle.
The two people who didn't survive. There were two children on that frozen planet, a brother and a sister. Whatever they might have been, whatever futures were waiting for them, whatever choices they might have made independently of each other, those futures were canceled. Not ended in the ordinary way lives end, canceled and repurposed. From the wreckage of those two ended lives came Berg Katse. Not a resurrection, a replacement. Not a person recovered from disaster, but a new being assembled from the raw material of two others, with consciousness attached and no instructions provided for how to use it. What those children were before the crash, their names, their individual personalities, what they wanted from lives that were already in motion before the mission failed. That thread remains largely unresolved even within the original Japanese series. It is a darkness within the darkness, a missing story at the center of the origin. That unresolved thread is the wound that sits underneath everything in Science Ninja Team Gatchaman. Every act of destruction Katse commands is downstream from a horror those two children had no power to prevent. The villain who threatened Earth for years is, in the truest and most literal sense, haunted by the people he was assembled from, by the identity he can never fully occupy, and by the creator who owns him as completely as a craftsman owns a tool. Here is the question that all of this forces onto the table. Does knowing what Berg Katse actually is make Zoltar more frightening? Or does it do something far more unsettling than frightening you?
We've been aware for some time that Spectra has managed to set up a secret base on Earth.
The question they were afraid to ask. There is a version of this story in which the genetic horror and the split identity make Berg Katse more dangerous, not less. A being without a coherent self, without the psychological anchor of a singular identity, with nothing to return to and no internal framework to moderate his choices, has a different relationship to destruction than a man who simply wants power. There is no mercy mechanism available to someone who was built without one. The normal human brakes on violence, empathy, projection, the ability to imagine being the person you're threatening, require a stable self to operate from. Katse doesn't have one. That is not metaphor. That is architecture. But there is another version, and this is the version that the American producers intuited, even if they couldn't have articulated it in a 1978 network meeting. Knowing what Berg Katse actually is opens something in you that should not be able to coexist with looking at a villain. Something that sits closer to recognition than to fear. Not sympathy for his actions. His actions are unambiguously destructive. Something older than that. A recognition of the wrongness of his origin. The fact that a conscious being can be constructed specifically to suffer, that existence itself can be handed to someone as an instrument, with consciousness attached as a side effect rather than an intention. That is not a question American network television in 1978 was prepared to let children sit with on a Saturday morning. That is the question that has been waiting, unasked, for 40 years.
I think the Spectrans are at it again. But if we're having another invasion, why hasn't Zark picked it up?
What the adaptation cost. Science Ninja Team Gatchaman had been in circulation since 1972. 6 years before the American version arrived, the full architecture of Berg Katse existed in those original broadcasts. The crash, the embryo fusion, the dual forms, the fractured psychology, the terrible dependency on Leader X. None of it made the translation into Battle of the Planets. The 1986 American adaptation G-Force, Guardians of Space, did not restore it either. For the entirety of the era in which this content defined Saturday mornings for an American generation, the center of the villain's story was invisible, not lost, not forgotten.
Die for you. Roger that.
Deliberately set aside because the people making the adaptation decision judged it too complicated, too strange, too difficult to explain to a network that needed something simple to sell advertising against. What American children received instead was a conqueror with a cape and a grudge. Functional, marketable. A villain who wanted Earth because villains want things, who failed repeatedly because heroes win, who wore the mask because that was what this kind of villain wore. A villain you could put on a lunchbox without raising any questions. The template worked, the merchandise sold, and the actual character, the thing underneath the template, waited in the original Japanese broadcasts for someone to eventually go looking. The last image that stays with you when you sit with the full story is not the purple mask, not the orbital cannon, not the defeated general retreating from G-Force. It is two children on a frozen planet, and the last moment in which two separate human beings existed as themselves, before something larger and colder than both of them decided their identities were raw material for something else. Berg Katse is what happens after that moment. Zoltar is what they sold you instead.
Trained almost since birth to develop those secret and mysterious powers.
The story that goes further. Did you sense as a kid that something was missing from Zoltar? That the mask was covering something the show refused to show you? The number of viewers who felt that absence, who felt the show was deliberately holding something back, is larger than you might expect. Leave it in the comments. There is a connected story waiting on this channel. Leader X, what it actually is, what it wanted from the experiment, and what the full cost of that experiment reveals about the entire architecture of the Spectra conflict. That video goes places the Katse origin doesn't reach. If this is the kind of excavation you want more of, the Vintage Vault is where it lives. Subscribe. The mask was always covering a mirror. It just took 40 years to hold it up.